Have you been wanting to learn CSS Grid and how to use the basics, some advanced features, and any gotchas that can get in your way? Well, this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that, and I'll show you each of those items and show you some tips and tricks on how to lay out your web pages using CSS Grid. So let's jump into it. All right, so this is our standard setup. So we have an index HTML. It has a couple of classes on this outer div, which are container and grid, and then some inner classes, which is item 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of those has a number. The styling for our style CSS looks something like this. We just have a width and height of 100%, no margin, no padding, a background color for our container class here, and then that's going to be a height 100%, and then this outline for each of the elements, so each of these divs. So I'm just using the element selector here for our CSS, and then we'll get into specifics on item styling in a different video. So subscribe, check out all the videos I have right now for CSS if you're interested, and like this video if it helps you, but we'll do that next time. This video is going to focus on the grid and how to use all the different attributes for laying out the grid in rows and columns and the way to do that. So let's jump into it. So right now we have our different divs and our outer div. So let's just let's minimize this a little bit. That way we can see our CSS, because this is where we're going to be. And I'll minimize these because those aren't going to change during this video. So to get started, we can define our grid using this syntax. The keyword here is display grid. In previous videos, you could do display flexbox, or I'm sorry, display flex, and that'll give you flexbox. Or if you do display block or inline block, there's all kinds of different ways to set this, but to use a grid layout, you need to use display grid. And so you start with that. And then each of the other attributes here, so grid template rows will set your rows, and then grid template columns will set the width of each of your columns. So what we should see here is we should have one row on the right hand side here that is 100 pixels tall, and then we should see 4 columns that are each 100 pixels wide. So if we refresh the page here, we see that. I'm using this repeat syntax, so you can do something else where you maybe did the calc function, and if you wanted to do 25%, so you do 100%, and you would divide that by 4. And so each of these are going to be 25% because this is the end result of the calc function. So if we made this bigger, we see that each of them is 25%, and this is our responsive layout. So we'll make this a little bit smaller over here, and we can use the calc function, or we can just set a number of pixels. One thing I do want to mention here is a special unit called the fraction unit, and that is specified by saying like 1 FR or 2 FR. And the fraction unit is going to take up the rest of the available space within a container. What the nice thing about this is if we had like a grid gap, let's say of like 10 pixels, and we'll get into explaining this a little bit later, but for demonstration purposes, if we had this still set to 25%, then we have a little bit of a gap here. And this calculation does the 25%, but it doesn't take into account this 10 pixels. And so you can see, here, I'll make this a little bit taller because I'm sure my face is in the way. All right, there we go. So you can see right here, there's a little scroll bar, which we don't really want. And so if we made this all the way to the edge, you can see it still has that scroll bar because it's not taking into account our grid gap. So if we used 1 FR, then that again doesn't have a scroll bar because it takes up the available space. So it accounts for this 10 pixels of gap between each of our elements up here. Cool thing, use FR or fraction units whenever you're dealing with grid. If you want it to be spaced out and you don't want to have to deal with a lot of math, you can utilize that and do it however you want. The other thing to note is you can mix different units. So I'm going to delete that grid gap, but if you wanted 2 rows, so you could do 50 pixels and like auto. And so let's say we only wanted 2 columns. So this should do a wrap. Let's make this like 100 pixels. So we made this. So make this a little over here on the right. And so you can see the second row is going to take up as much space as it can. You can mix and match these different units. So like if we wanted to do, 25% here instead of that, then you can mix and match pixels, percents, and auto, FRs, all of that you can mix and match, which is really cool. Moving on, let's do a different syntax. We have this grid signifier, and this is going to be the same as our template rows and template columns. This is a shorthand, so you can say rows, which is this first half before the slash. And so we have 1 row that is 100 pixels tall, and then we have 4 columns that are each 100 pixels wide. And so we can specify all of that in one line using grid. And then another thing to do is if you have some kind of special syntax or layout, you can do what's called grid template areas. And so if you have like a header and you want a main page on the left hand side, the dot signifies nothing, like it doesn't have a name. And then you have a sidebar and footer on the bottom. This is how you could lay it out and give names to it. So this is yet another way of laying out a custom grid and giving names to it, so then you can assign values to each one of the individual elements. If we refresh this, we see that this is the same as what we had started with. And there's an even more succinct syntax where, here, let me close this index.html, give us a little bit more room here. Again, we have display grid, and then grid template will allow us to define all of that, which is all of this information up here. And so we have the same header. These are just names that are given. We could utilize that within our items. We'll cover that in the next video, but for right now, this is how you could lay it out. Each of these rows are 100 pixels, and then each of the columns here are 100 pixels. So this could be a repeat 3, 100 pixels as well. It's split by the slash. One thing to really keep in mind is rows always come before columns, which I've tried to organize the page in that way as well. Rows and then columns, and that's how the shorthands always work. So rows and then columns, and that's the same way here. You can also see we've specified the grid area, and so this is how you can associate names to different things. And so we should see this first item as the full header, this bottom one as the full footer, and then we'll have this one as a left-hand side main, and this one as a right-hand side sidebar. We can see that here. The dot signifies that we don't have anything. If we change this to sidebar, then we should see an even split, and we see that right there. So that is how you can lay it out that way. Let's move on. I'll show you some other cool stuff with grid gaps. Here we go. And if we, oh, I did that wrong. Here we go. Let's try this again. We are going back to our template rows and columns, and there are these 2 other elements called row gap and column gap. As you probably assume, this one is setting the gap between elements for the row, and then this is the setting the column gap between 2 columns. So if we refresh this, we see something like this. If we went back to what we originally had, and we had like 4 and 100 pixels here, then we should see them all in one row, and they're spaced out. You don't really get to see the row gap because we only have one single row as specified here, but you can see the gaps in between there. If we brought this back, so now we have 2 rows and 2 columns, and the FR takes up all the available space. So if we made this bigger, it's going to take all the space that is available for it and do that nice calculation so that we can take into account the 2 gaps. Another way to specify this using shorthand is using the grid gap, and you can do that again with row first, and then column, and this should give us the same look. So I refresh, it's the same thing. If we change this to 20 pixels, then we get a little bit more space in between our column. So you can see that that increased. If we did it even more, you would see a bigger gap. So you can control your gutters, which were, how tables were laid out previous to the introduction of grid. That way you can specify all of that and space things out appropriately. So it used to be a giant pain to do this. You can also accomplish a lot of this using Flexbox. Usually the bigger, more robust layouts in web pages will use grid, and then you can use Flexbox inside of each of the grids to lay things out in like a start and end or space between. I'll show you how to style specific elements within a grid here in just a minute. Also, all this code is available on GitHub. The link is in the description, so check it out, download it, and play around with it on your own machine. I'm also questioning whether we should be using CodePen. I know that several people use that in their videos, so if you prefer CodePen over GitHub, leave me a comment down below and let me know, hey, I would rather have CodePen or something else. I can also accommodate that as well. So right now it's on GitHub. I'll throw a link in the description and you can check it out. So if we roll this back, so we're done with grid gap. We've covered the different way to lay out our grid. We've covered display grid and some shorthand. Now let's talk about whenever elements don't quite fit into our grid. If we have auto-generated grid tracks, which are also called implicit grid tracks. So if we have something like this, here, I'll make this a little bigger. So if we have something like this where we've overridden the last item and we've put it into a place where we actually don't have a row and column. We only have one row in this layout, in this grid, and we have 3 columns that are each 200 pixels. We can specify grid auto columns and grid auto rows, and that'll say, okay, whenever you encounter adding a element into the grid that is outside of the normal grid flow, then this is how I want to lay it out. Let's say, we wanted to have any new elements be like super huge. And so if we change the columns and rows here, that makes this number 4, which is our item 4, super huge. You can roll this back to 100 and you see it change back to that smaller size. The other way to specify how elements come into the grid is using this flow. So right now things get laid out here at the top and they will wrap and then go to the next row and the next row and the next row. And this is the default here for grid auto flow. So we can change this to column and that will change how things flow. And instead of going row and then wrapping, they will go by column and then try and fit into each of the columns one after another. These 3 elements are ways that you can specify, how new elements come into the grid, what to do with exceptions, and handle them appropriately. We'll move on from there. And now we're going to get into styling. This is how you can move items in your grid horizontally and vertically. This is really similar to Flexbox. So you have justify items and align items. Justify items is gonna change things horizontally. You have an element and you want to center it. It's gonna center it horizontally. If you have align items, then it's gonna align that vertically. What we should see is this is gonna be centering items within our grid. So if we see that, we have our same layout, which is 200 pixels for one single row. And then we have 4 columns, which are each 125 pixels. And we're centering each of the items within those buckets, if you will. So if we don't have this, it'll look like this. And so if we bring back just the justify items, then they should be centered horizontally. And then if we bring in the align items, they're centered vertically. Another way to specify this with shorthand, which there's a lot of shorthand if you aren't picking up on that in grid. So definitely check out different ways you can do shorthand with each of the elements. With this one, it's called place items. And so that's gonna set both justify items and align items to center. So we see that that happens here, and this is the same thing that we specified with the 2 attributes. All right, now if our grid needs to be moved or centered or adjusted, let's say, our screen size is really big and we wanted to move the entire grid. So like, this piece here, move it somewhere else in the page, then we can accomplish that using the content. So justify content and align content. Again, we have a very similar grid layout where 1 row, 4 columns. And here we have it in the center. So if we wanted to do, like justify content, flex start, then it would go left, again, because it is adjusting horizontally. And then if we want this to be flex end, this would go all the way to the end. So we should see it all the way down here, and we do. So if we roll this back a little bit, the cool thing is we can also use our place item center, and that will center each of these right in the middle. And so we get that, and we can move our grid around. The justify content and align content move the entire grid, and then place items will move items within each of the buckets of a grid. So if we comment this out, there is also another shorthand here. So place content instead of place items, and that will accomplish the same thing here. We could even bring in our place items and make it super shorthandy and get them all in the middle here. So I hope that this was beneficial. I hope that you learned a few things about CSS Grid and some nice shorthand and some shortcuts. The next video will be about styling individual items, similar to how we kind of touched on here with this item and the grid column and the grid row. I'll make another video about that, and I'll link it here, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.